This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
Hi, this is Greg LeBlanc. Welcome to Unsiloed. And today I'm here with Robert Frank, who is, I guess, the recently retired professor of business and economics at Cornell University, and is the author of many books. Most recently, this one called Under the Influence, which I think it really kind of encapsulates a lot of the themes that you've been discussing over the years, but just does it in a way that's like just incredibly well written. And for anybody who hasn't been exposed to your work, this is going to be a great starter for folks, for future Robert Frank fans. But in addition to that, you've had some other recent books. There's this one, Success and Luck, another fantastic book. Going back a little bit further in time, we've got The Economic Naturalist, which is a whole bunch of little tiny short explanations of things that we see in the everyday world, which is really nice. In addition to that, we've got The Darwin Economy. We've got The Winner Take All Society, which you co-authored. We've got Luxury Fever, Choosing the Right Pond, Passions Within Reason. All those books, I promise you, I have somewhere, in my office or in boxes or, storage lockers somewhere, but they've all been a big part of my education. And in addition to that, of course, you are the author of one of the leading textbooks for both intro and intermediate microeconomics. This one here is, I don't know what edition you're up to, but this one is the one that I think I've used most recently, and I use this and I've been using this for about 20 years. In my
10th edition of that
courses.
book has just come out. Yeah, I'm delighted that it's still alive.
Well, they've got to come up with some machine learning experts to, kind of train on whatever it is you're doing, so that you can just keep it going forever. But great books. For those, I don't know how many people just sit around and read textbooks for fun. I'm one of those crazy people that'll grab a textbook on a 6-hour flight to somewhere and just power through it, because a well-written textbook is rare, but when you find one, it's a pleasure to read, because you can get so much knowledge in such a short period of time. If you spread it out over 3 months, it's almost like waiting too long for the for the punchline, for the plot twist. But anyway, welcome, Robert.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's an occasion I'm looking forward to.
Now, I think, as I mentioned before we started, I think I met you back in like 1986 or so. And when you were back in those days, you were interested in rational choice, and you had, as they used to call it back in those days, I don't know if anybody still uses that terminology, except maybe in political science, but you were exploring sort of the limits of it, and you came up with, you were thinking about behavioral finance, and you had a course on behavioral finance, and you had these two elements of what you thought at the time were behavioral finance. One is behavior with choice with regret and choice without regret. And you say now that you no longer think of yourself as a behavioral economist, because behavioral economists are focusing only on kind of the first part of that. Could you tell us a little bit about, I think the second part maybe we would call public economics now, or
it was
law
really
economics,
a course in behavioral economics, although the field didn't really much exist then. This was in the mid-'80s, this course that you're talking about. And Dick Thaler had come to Cornell while I was away on my first sabbatical. I got back and met him shortly after getting back, and he and I spent long hours talking about all these things we saw out there in the world that didn't seem to match what the models predicted. And he was teaching a course. I would imagine that course he was teaching in the business school at Cornell. I was then in the economics department. His course was probably the first real course in behavioral economics taught anywhere. A couple of years later, launched a course in the Arts College. I decided to call it Departures from Rational Choice. I wouldn't call it that now. I think that just kindled a lot of fruitless debates about what rationality even means. But anyway, that is what I called it. And as you say, I organized the material in two parts: Departures from Rational Choice with Regret. That's the kind of stuff Thaler had been adapting from the work of Kahneman and Tversky. He had spent a year on sabbatic with them out of the West Coast. And he was really focused on, as they were, the mistakes that people make. We've got all the information we need to solve the problem. It's not a hard problem, but still we get the wrong answer. So when we explain to people that they're, for example, taking sunk costs into effect and why that's not a good idea to do that, you see a little resistance at first, but once somebody gets the point, then they seem immediately to feel motivated to change their behavior. They don't want to keep on taking sunk costs into account when they make decisions. So I call that departures with regret. But the behavior I was interested in mostly was of a different sort. I called it departures from at least the predictions of the rational choice model without regret. Those are things that when the economist says that's not what the model predicted you would do, people don't say, "Oh, well, thanks for telling me that. I'm going to change my behavior going forward." No, they don't feel any regret at all about what they've just done. So, for example, you might leave a tip in a restaurant you'll never visit again. The economist explains, well, there's nothing the waiter can do. He's already provided good service. He can't withhold good service in the future because you're not going back there. People don't say, "Oh, why did I think of that?" They don't say that. They say, "What a creep for even suggesting such a thing." The guy gave his end of the bargain. I want to uphold mine and leave the tip. He's depending on that for his family and own well-being. So I feel like a creep if I didn't follow through there. So that's departures without regret. And mainly, I've focused on collective action problems. I mean, I think the modern disciples of Adam Smith are too enthusiastic by half. They think Smith thought that if you just turn selfish, greedy blokes loose in the marketplace and tell them to seek their own ends, you'll get the best of all possible outcomes for society as a whole. Smith didn't think that at all. To him, what was remarkable was that you often got good results from self-interest in the marketplace. But as he knew very well, there are just scores of situations where each individual does what's right for him or her, and we get outcomes that none of us likes very well. I stand up to see better. You're behind me. You have to stand up too. We all stand. We don't see any better if we'd all remain comfortably seated. And so my focus in much of my work has been on cases where we don't seem to regret what we've done. So even though we all realize that it wasn't useful that we all stand, we don't regret standing since the alternative was not to see at all. But if we could take action collectively to somehow remain in our seats, we would like that outcome better.
Now, economists as a whole, I think, are probably could be described as utilitarians, at least in terms of their policy objectives. But economists also seem to have I guess you'd say, a preference for what might be also thought of as libertarian sensibilities, and those often come into conflict, particularly when you're dealing with these collective action problems. I think a lot of us have been observing with interest the debates around, the coronavirus. Yes. And all the interventions that have been made in order to control the spread of the virus, and this has aroused quite a bit of opposition by people who are interested in protecting individual liberties. So why is it that economists who seem to be kind of utilitarians, or law and economics people who are utilitarians, why do they sometimes resist the implications of utilitarianism, which suggests some kind of centralized control of individual action in the scenarios you described?
Well, if you go back to Smith and Hume, I mean, economics really originated in Scotland in the 1700s. Those people were moral philosophers. They were consequentialists. I mean, if you think of the two main schools today as consequentialists, the ones who believe that the best choice is the one that leads to the best consequences overall. Hard to see how anybody could really be opposed to that idea. The opposing school is the so-called deontologists, the ones who feel that there are certain moral rules you have to follow, irrespective of what the consequences might be. The economists are really deeply grounded in the consequentialist way of looking at things, and I think the libertarian bent that you mentioned is a much more recent phenomenon. I think the idea that government is the root of all evil, that's not an idea that was in Smith or in any of his immediate successors. No, they were well aware that individual action leads to outcomes we don't like much of the time, and it's compellingly in our interest often to intervene in those cases. We can change people's incentives to steer them towards outcomes we would all like much better than that. So I think the libertarian tradition that's taken root in economics is really a very recent phenomenon, and I think it's led people astray in a fundamental way.
You've got a lot of big ideas. One of the big ideas that I think you emphasize in this book is the whole idea of behavioral externalities, there's a lot of implications of this. Could you describe how you first began to think about what you call behavioral externalities?
Yeah, I think the first example I really focused on was one when I was renovating a house. This was during my very first sabbatical. I was in Washington, D.C. I had a crew who would come and work, and when they were doing work on the spots they couldn't reach, rather than set up scaffolds and work in the conventional way, they would pile up sheetrock buckets, these 5-pound plastic buckets of joint compound, one on top of another, 3 high often, and then put planks across them and stand on these structures and work on the high spots they couldn't otherwise reach. And occasionally, not often, a couple of times a week though, those structures would just teeter and collapse, and they'd be there in a heap on the floor, bruised, sometimes bloodied. I asked them, why don't you guys get scaffolds the way most of the crews do? Oh, they're too expensive, number one. They take too long to set up and move. This is just much quicker. Okay, well, if they'd been having a hard time buying lunch and putting heat in the house, that would have been one thing. But these same guys would show up at the work site every morning in brand new vans with plush carpeting on the walls, state-of-the-art stereo systems inside. If they'd just bought a van 2 or 3 years old, they would have had more than enough money for scaffolds. But a van 2 or 3 years old, I asked them once why they didn't just buy an old van and if you couldn't afford scaffolding, buy the scaffolding and make do with a slightly old van. Oh, no, but the other guys have new vans. It just seems too shoddy. So I think that was the first time I thought about the collective action problem in spending. Whether your van's okay depends not just on its absolute qualities. Of course, it's how does it compare with other vans? And if all the guys you hang with have a new van with a state-of-the-art stereo system in it, and you don't, if yours is 2 or 3 years old, then yours seems a little shabby, and so you'll cut corners in order to catch up on that dimension that's more salient to you. So that was kind of the first example. And I've thought since my earliest books about how context shapes evaluation and how that in turn shapes the way we spend our money, and how in the aggregate, much of what we spend goes largely for naught. I mean, the behavioral evidence is as clear as it can be that beyond a certain point, when we all spend more on many items in the private consumption sphere, the only effect of that is to raise the bar that defines what we consider adequate.
But I mean, that story encapsulates a whole bunch of different things that you talk about. One is sort of the diffusion of beliefs about the world, right? So the probability estimates that they might have about the danger of doing what they're doing, right? That's something which is more or less socially developed. Then there's the preferences, right? So, preferences for certain things can be diffused socially, right? Then there's the positional externalities, right? Which is, I'm going to have higher status than you because I have a better car than you, or I am more, I have higher status because I'm willing to take on more danger, right, in this environment. Kind of and then there's the collective action problem, which is embedded in the latter two, right, the Thomas Schelling story. So I think out of that story you can go in so many different directions, and I think you do in this book. You talk a lot about herding and how herding is a rational response to uncertainty in the environment under a wide range of circumstances.
Yeah, somebody asked me for the most compelling example I could offer of how we're influenced by what other people do. And I think we think of it as generally a bad thing. I clipped a tweet. I did a screen capture of a tweet by an economist I follow on Twitter, who had found a post on a teenager's website. He said he's always been told not to follow his peers, but why hasn't anybody told him or given him advice about how not to be a bad influence on his peers? He couldn't understand that. And the term peer influence or peer behavior has such a negative connotation. I was really quite opposed to using it in the title or subtitle of the book or even in any of the marketing materials. But then my editor at Princeton said, how about if we make the subtitle be Putting Peer Pressure to Work? And I thought, yeah, that has a kind of a man bites dog feel to it. It's clear that we have an interest in the peer environment. It influences us so strongly. And the example I was about to offer was one in a film I saw decades ago now. It was an Alan Funt film. He was the candid camera impresario all those years on television. He would put people in bizarre little vignettes and filmed what they do. And so in this one, he put an ad in a paper notifying interviews of a fantastic sounding job. It had a huge salary, lots of travel opportunities, high pay, very few formal requirements. It sounded like a dream job, all right. And so, of course, many people wanted to be interviewed for it. And so he booked appointments. And what we see in the film is a guy shows up for his appointment. He's shown in by a secretary into a waiting room where there are already 4 others sitting silently. He sits down. Nobody says anything to anybody. The film goes on about its business. 2 or 3 other scenes unfold, but it keeps coming back and shows him waiting there in the waiting room. Finally, we see a close-up of his face. He's impassive as he's been the whole time so far, but then suddenly looks alarmed and is looking all about. The camera pulls back and we see that the reason he's alarmed is that the other 4 have stood at no apparent signal and are taking off all their clothing. And his alarm seems to mount second by second. And then you can just see he tips. He almost shrugs and stands himself and takes off all of his own clothes. And the scene ends. They're all 5 standing there naked, waiting for a signal about what comes next. And so I recall vividly seeing that. I said, no way would I have done that, if I'm in his situation. But then thinking about it later, he's a guy who probably doesn't have a job like mine. This sounds like an enormous improvement over his current situation. He doesn't know what's coming next. If anybody knows, it's the guys who got there first, the 4 who got there before him. They seem to think it's worth this next step in the process. Who is he to say no? He's got a choice. He can either say, well, the hell with this, I'm out of the loop, or he can say, all right, I'll go this one next step and see what happens. So, the world really is a complicated place. It's a dangerous place. I know very little about what's going on out there. So do you, but together, all of us collectively know a great deal about what's going on. And when we see other people acting confidently in a certain way that we don't understand, if you don't have at least an impulse to investigate whether you ought to be doing something like what they're doing, you're probably not very well suited for functioning in this world that we live in. So yeah, it's a hugely important impulse in human behavior, and to presume that it always leads you astray is just to miss the fact that if we didn't take cues from others, we just wouldn't be able to have any practical way to make our way in the world. Of course, it does lead us astray in important cases. Often it's an influence for good. In both of those cases, we have an interest in the fact that others influence us. I don't think anybody could dispute that with a straight face. And then this fact too, what is the social environment but an aggregate consequence of our individual choices? So the smoking rate, do we care about that? Yeah, I don't want my kids to smoke. You don't want your kids to smoke. None of us wants our kids to smoke. Have you ever met any parent who said, I hope my kid grows up to be a smoker? Well, the one thing that predicts the likelihood of your kid growing up to smoke is the fraction of her peers who smoke. And so if that was a low number, you'd be delighted. What's the number? It's just the consequence of all the people who decided to smoke divided by the total number of people. But nobody, when deciding whether to smoke, takes that second causal arrow into account. I affect the social environment. The social environment affects me. There's nothing I can do to affect how the social environment affects me, but there are things we might do to encourage people to take into account, or at least to act as if they took into account how their own behavior would affect the social environment. We did that in the case of smoking to good effect.
So in kind of the JDM literature, we talk about things like groupthink, and we highlight them as an example of irrationality. We highlight them as examples of kind of thinking gone astray. And when we look at social proof, for instance, it's used as a tool for manipulating people, to make a sale or, to get your way and increase your profits and so forth. But you can use these tools just as easily for good, right? I think that's sort of what the nudge movement's all about. It's about how do you, leverage take people as they are, meet them where they are, and use their biases and heuristics in ways that benefit them.
And the reason they're not doing what would be best for them to do is sometimes, as the nudge movement explains, the fact that they don't know what would be best for them to do, or they're short-sighted, or they lack discipline, or they're making cognitive errors of one kind or another. Another reason is that they're doing what other people like them do. And that's been the focus in this book for me. I use the term behavioral externalities. It's exactly analogous to the conventional externalities we've always talked about in economics, like congestion and smoke and noise and other effects where third parties are influenced by what we do. In this case, the focus is on how our behavior affects what others do, how what we say and do affects the behavior and utterances of other people. And sometimes we want to discourage people from influencing others in specific ways. Sometimes we want to encourage them to do more of what they're doing. And there are lots of simple levers that will facilitate our doing that. And sometimes these levers run afoul of libertarian objections, as you mentioned before, but I think that's just something that we need to think about from an overall consequentialist framework. I mean, if we're spewing smoke into the air, I think most honest libertarians say a tax on smoke emissions is justified because smoke emissions cause harm to other people who can't do anything about it. Well, it's the same with behavioral externalities.
Well, I mean, you talk about the benefits of a belief in free will and a belief in individual determination, but an acceptance of the reality of behavioral externalities causes one to question that somewhat, right? So in the context of coronavirus, we've all learned, hey, you could be going around infecting people and not even knowing it. And so you need to internalize the potential costs that you're imposing on others when you're wandering around, breathing on people and so forth. I think most people don't have a fundamental understanding that if they start smoking, they're probably going to increase substantially the probability that a whole bunch of other people are going to be smoking, and they should have that on their conscience before they, light up. Do you think that it's realistic to expect people to understand the consequences of their actions, or should we just give up on that and rely entirely on Pigouvian taxes to try and discourage
I think it would be better if people understood that their actions have consequences for others, and it would be good too if they cared about that. But I think the main advantage I see in trying to explain how our own actions affect others in those ways is to legitimize the simple measures we can take that would encourage people to behave accordingly. So, for example, in Israel now, they are starting to limit attendance at events and other activities to people who have been vaccinated against the virus. There's enormous objection to that. They think that's a violation. The people who don't like that think that's an enormous violation of their right not to be vaccinated. Well, you can assert a right not to be vaccinated. Okay. I don't know how far we want to push that, but you can't insist on having the right to put someone else's life in danger gratuitously. If you attend events as a carrier of the virus, you put other people in danger. You don't have a right to do that. And the nice thing about this way of thinking about the problem is that
we could imagine a Pigouvian tax that was sufficiently high that it would, reduce vaccine resistance to a
exactly.
Level,
We could say, show your license to get into this concert, or we could tax people who don't get vaccinated heavily enough that they're all going to get vaccinated, and we won't need to ask to see a license. But the beauty of the Pigouvian tax approach is that we have to tax something. And it's long been my claim that we can raise all the revenue needed to support a very expansive view of a well-functioning society without taxing anything other than behaviors or activities or goods or services that either directly or indirectly cause harm to other people. The scope for raising revenue through such taxes is enormous. We should not be taxing payrolls. Why should we tax payrolls? Hiring, that discourages companies from hiring new workers. Why do we want to do that? Tax cigarettes. Alcohol taxes are way too low. The harm from, the top 10% of all alcohol drinkers consume half of all the alcohol and account for virtually all of the problems associated with heavy alcohol consumption. Accidents, family abuse, other costs are almost all stemming from the people in the top 10%. A stiff tax on alcohol consumption would force them to consider the option of consuming less. There have been empirical studies showing that people, and once they consume less, then it will be the custom in their circle to consume less, and so it will be easier for them to consume less in the next round. It was the same with smoking. Smoking is one of the heaviest habits to break known to man. I had a friend who was a heroin addict. He said it was much easier for him to quit heroin than it had been to quit smoking. We didn't tax cigarettes heavily, though, until 1980, when there were studies showing that exposure to secondhand smoke made people more likely to get various diseases. That was the familiar externality rationale for taxing behaviors. The people couldn't avoid secondhand smoke, so we had to protect them from being damaged by others. But exposure to secondhand smoke, that's a minuscule injury compared to the injury you cause by making other people's children more likely to smoke, or other people more likely to smoke. Mm-hmm. The tax we imposed, even though it was stiff, didn't have much of an effect at first. People who smoke have a hard time quitting. Very few of them do quit. A few of them did. A few others didn't start. And that meant every peer group that those people belonged to had one less smoker in it, which meant every one of the people in those peer groups was less likely to begin or remain a smoker. And so over the years, we've seen a dramatic fall in the smoking rate, over 50% back when I was a teenager. now less than 14%. It's rare to find anybody other than a tobacco stockholder who thinks that's a bad outcome. We did right by people by doing that.
Do you think that economics can learn a bit more from epidemiology? I mean, we're starting to talk about crime as an infectious disease.
Once you see behavioral externalities in one context, it sensitizes your eye. You see them in virtually every domain we inhabit. It's just, I think, a simple consequence of the fact that we're always in new situations. We're always exposed to unfamiliar stimuli. And if we don't take cues from what others who know more than we do, on average, we're not going to do very well adapting to these situations. So, yeah, I think the epidemiological view of behavior is just hugely. Obesity was one of the first epidemiological papers that really got people thinking in these terms. The landmark paper by Fowler and Christakis showed how highly contagious obesity is. There was a natural experiment even done a few years later where they sent a military family to a new post. If the new location had an obesity rate 1% higher than where they'd been, the adult members in the family were 5% more likely to become obese in the new location. It's the dominant effect on many behaviors.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting how we respond very differently, though. The number of people who died of the coronavirus in the past year is equal to the annual toll of smoking in the United States. And yet, I think if you were to propose policies that seriously restricted people's access to cigarettes, there would be an uproar far greater than the uproar that we've seen requiring people to wear masks or to socially distance.
Right now we're getting the smoking rate down year by year. As I say, it's less than 14% now. We could tax cigarettes more heavily. There are enforcement issues. You have black markets and so the tax approach isn't the unique solution, but we're making it less convenient to smoke year by year. There are fewer places where you can smoke, and as more people obey regulations, this is a point Cass Sunstein makes in a recent book. It's less likely that others will feel emboldened to violate regulations, even though they're not enforced strictly. So yeah, I think we're making progress on that front.
Now, I think another big idea of yours is that of positional externalities. This is something which, once you become sensitized to that idea, you see it everywhere, right? And you see the massive waste that could be avoided in the academic environment. You look at students. I mean, when I was growing up, I don't know anybody who took an SAT prep class, but now I think if you don't take an SAT prep class, you're probably not going to get into university.
You'll look stupider than you really are if you don't, because everybody else is taking them. So merely to appear as competent as you actually are, you've got to join. Yeah, and it's more intense in some environments than others. I mean, in South Korea, a friend told me that middle-income families spend about 20% of their income on exam prep courses for their young kids.
Right, and it's not making them more skilled or more competent or more capable as employees.
A total waste of money.
It's just helping. Yeah. And so you could you could say the same thing about plastic surgery. You could say the same thing about the entire industry of cosmetics
and there too.
Management.
South Korea is blazing the trail. They spend more and more people have cosmetic surgical interventions in South Korea than almost any place else, and it's an alarmingly, at least to my ear, an alarmingly high proportion of the population.
Right. I mean, I would be in favor of any legislation that restricted our need to manipulate.
Yeah, and those of us who don't get procedures now look older than we really are.
That's right. That's right. So then I could actually, I would look young back in the 1950s at my age, my appearance would make me look really young. Now I look really old. But I mean, in the more important sense, when we think about luxury consumption, and the pursuit of wealth, and it's not just sort of status, the appearance of status, but in terms of conspicuous consumption, you mentioned, cars like Porsches versus Ferraris and so forth. But even in very, what seem to be necessities rather than luxuries, like our housing and our education and so forth, there's just a massive, what you would call overinvestment in these resources.
Yeah, this process is often called keeping up with the Joneses, and that's an expression I just think has been so destructive to people's understanding of what's going on here. I've had junior colleagues I've worked with on this kind of issue, and the first piece of advice I always give them is never use the phrase "keeping up with the Joneses." That seems to conjure up images of insecure people who are trying to appear like they've got more than they really have. They're showing off. They're bluffing. I think the underlying phenomenon is much simpler than that. It's that every evaluation we make is very heavily shaped by whatever handy frame of reference we have at our disposal. So you're going with your 6-year-old to see her grandparents. Are we almost there yet? She'll ask. Well, if there are 10 miles left on a 120-mile journey, you'll say, yeah, we're almost there. But what if there are 10 miles left on a 12-mile journey? You say, no, we got a long way to go. It's the same 10 miles. Context just shapes every single evaluation we make. Is it cold out? I grew up in Miami. Is it cold out? It's 60 degrees. It's November. We're going to a football game tonight. We wore every warm garment we could muster on a 60-degree night. If you ask somebody in Montreal, is it cold out on a 60-degree sunny day in March? They'll think you're stupid. But the answer to the question is the exact opposite of the answer I would have given on that 60-degree occasion in Miami. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I lived in a 2-room house with no running water, no electricity. Never for a moment during the 2 years I lived there did it seem in any way unsatisfactory. It was a great house, actually, in the local context. I was proud to have colleagues and friends over. If I lived in a house like that in Ithaca, my kids would not have wanted their friends to know where we lived. They would have been ashamed. I would have been ashamed. To live in such a house here would be a vivid statement that you had failed to meet even the minimal expectations of a life in this context. And so, of course, when people say, what kind of a house do I need? The local environment is going to shape the answer to that question. And one of the sources of waste that's been most pronounced in recent decades has been the fact that the income distribution has been tilting so heavily to the top. The people at the top have been getting all the income gains. The higher up you go, the bigger the gains. The people at the top have been building bigger. That's what people do everywhere when they get more money. The people in the middle don't get angry. They like to see the pictures of the mansions. The people just below the top, though, they go to the wedding receptions that are now held in the homes rather than in country clubs. We need bigger. They build bigger. Now the people just below them need a dining room for 18, not just 12. They build bigger. The median house is about 50% larger than it was a few decades ago. The median price is even a steeper increase than that, even though the median earner, men anyway, don't earn any more per hour in real terms than they did several decades ago. Where are they getting money? They're working every margin to make ends meet and often aren't making ends meet. They can't keep up. Why are they trying to keep up? Because if you don't keep up, then it's your kids who will go to the schools with metal detectors out front, where the other students are scoring in the 15th and 20th percentile in reading and math. The good schools are in the more expensive neighborhood. If others are spending more, you got to spend more, or else it's your kids who'll go to the poor schools.
Well, I mean, part of that is unavoidable, right? I mean, as an individual, so if you go back to your original book, which is the Choosing of the Right Pond. It's not. I don't think that was your first one, but that was your second one, right? Choosing the Right Pond, which really I took it as in part kind of a self-help book, right? I took away from the book. There are things that you can do as an individual to bolster your subjective sense of well-being by modifying the things that you use to compare yourself with, right? So instead of comparing yourself with the folks you went to school with, I just read in the Wall Street Journal that, one of my best friends from, high school just made, I don't know, $700 million on some stock trade. Right. And instead of spending time comparing myself to them, I can spend a lot of time with my graduate students, who
make
are,
you feel rich,
at least while they're in school, making less than me. Right. So it makes me feel a whole lot better. Right. So there are things that you can do to change who you're using as the basis for social comparison. But then there are things you can't avoid, right? If you want your kids to get a decent education, then you have to play this game, right? If you want to, get access to certain necessities, if you want to have, a low crime rate in your front door, then you have to, play this game to some extent, right?
There are things you can do. As you said, you can choose your own peer group in limits. You can choose people who don't smoke. You can choose people who don't spend foolishly, and all those are well and good. But in the larger picture, your choices are limited. And here's the example that I think I find compelling. Milton Friedman, and it goes to your earlier point about libertarianism. Milton Friedman strongly objected that the government was denying people the right to decide for themselves how much to save when they forced them to participate in the Social Security system. They took your money away from you while you were working, and then they used that money to write checks to people in retirement. Why shouldn't I have the right to decide for myself how much to save for retirement? Sounds like a terrific rallying cry. Of course, people should be free. Who's not in favor of freedom? I haven't met anybody who's not in favor of freedom lately, anyway. Here's the problem. If I were in charge of my own retirement savings, and other parents were too, some parents, not all, but some parents would take money out of those accounts and bid for houses in better school districts. Then I'd be faced with a choice. I could either do likewise, or I could send my children to schools regarded as inferior. If we all bid for houses in better school districts, however, the effect will merely be to bid up the prices of those houses. Half of all kids will still attend bottom half schools, exactly the same as before, and we will have ended up eating cat food in retirement because we decimated our retirement savings account. The Social Security system annihilates that dilemma. I don't have to worry about taking money out of my retirement account and using it to finance a fruitless bidding war for a house in a better school district, because I can't do that. It's not available to me. In these situations where individual interests and group interests are in conflict, we have to act collectively. A mere nudge isn't going to solve that problem. You don't wag your finger at parents and say, don't be imprudent. Careful, if you don't save, you will end up eating cat food in retirement. Most parents will say, the job one is to get my kid into the best school I can. I'll worry about retirement when I get there. You cited Tom Schelling's early examples. The one that influenced my thinking early on was the hockey helmet example. Why do hockey players skate without helmets whenever they're allowed to, but often vote for a rule requiring themselves to wear helmets? It's that taking your helmet off gives you an edge. And if you take yours off, they take theirs off, but then the two teams have the same winning probabilities as before, and everybody's exposed to greater risk of injury. You don't solve that problem with a nudge. You don't put a sign in the locker room saying, caution, skating without a helmet could result in serious injury. They're going to skate without helmets. You need a rule saying you can't play unless you have a helmet. So those are times when we have to sort of dust off John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. Mill, I think, was the greatest champion of individual liberty. He said the only legitimate reason to tell an individual that he or she can't do what's desired is to prevent undue harm to others. He didn't say undue harm, but he must have meant that, since there's nothing you can do anytime, anywhere that doesn't cause at least some harm to somebody out there. So if you're going to do something that's not going to benefit you much, but it's going to cause undue harm to others, that's a perfectly legitimate rationale for the collective to say, no, we don't want ourselves to do those things.
Right. And so a subset of these scenarios are crying out for what you would call kind of a positional arms control agreement, right?
The Social Security tax is one.
Yep.
The progressive income tax is one. Better still, we could adopt a progressive consumption tax. Tax the next dollar of consumption at ever steeper rates, and then the people at the top who are initiating these expenditure cascades, where now the average wedding in New York City is $76,000. Average weddings countrywide 3 times as much in real terms as 3 decades ago. People would spend less, and that would be a good thing. Nobody's any happier.
And you call this I think you call this the mother of all cognitive illusions, right? That the resistance to this idea is based on an illusion.
It's long been my theme, Greg, that if the wealthy spent less on high-end consumption, if they did that in tandem, that would merely lower the bar that defines what they feel they need to spend on those things. They wouldn't be any less happier. So, for example, if all the mansions were half as big as they are now, probably the people who live in them would be happier than they are now, since the big properties are such a nuisance to manage. If the only reason you need a big one is that other ones in your circle have a big one like that, then you'd all be happier if they were smaller. Take that same money and spend it in the public sphere on, I don't know, vaccine research, for example, hospital surge capacity, infrastructure reinvestment, renewable energy. There are all sorts of things that we know would make a difference in people's lives. Make that expenditure shift. Not only would the poor and the middle class be better off, but the rich themselves would be better off. And then the question is, why don't the rich vote for people who will do exactly what I claim would be better for them? And that's the answer I offer. I say they suffer from what I call the mother of all cognitive illusions. They think paying higher taxes would be harmful to their ability to enjoy the good life. They're wrong about that.
Now, of course, this wouldn't eliminate the jockeying for status, right? This wouldn't eliminate the positional externalities. It would just mean that the prices of these things would have to come down.
Nothing we do will alter the fact that there are going to be 10% of the people in the top 10%. That's a given. And right. Much of what's good in life is doled out according to where you are in the hierarchy. The fact of the matter is that that's just not going to change. But because there are such rich rewards from being at the top of the hierarchy, people invest enormous sums trying to get there. And many of those expenditures are exactly analogous to arms expenditures and military arms race. And it's completely uncontroversial to embrace the logic of the arms control agreement. We'd all rather spend more on schools and hospitals, but because having relatively fewer arms than our rivals entails a risk of loss of independence, we don't dare spend less there. So in order to keep on par in that domain, we've got to find more resources. Where do they come from? From schools and hospitals. And so if we can sign an agreement, an enforceable agreement that will steer resources away from bombs into schools and hospitals, that seems like a good idea. And people do that when they can. These other policies are analogous to that.
There's some other less comprehensive policy proposals that have attempted to address this, right? You mentioned some in your book, like taxes on luxury goods, right? Taxes on boats and fancy cars and maybe even fancy weddings or jewelry or, expensive wine or something like that. I think there are obvious reasons why that would be insufficient.
Those attempts to tax specific luxuries, things that are considered to be wasteful in the particular, have almost and everywhere been failures. If you tax something because it's considered frivolous, there are a lot of things out there. If you're trying to demonstrate that you've got robust purchasing power to others, there are people for whom that does seem to be a goal. Then if you tax luxury cars, then they'll buy luxury airplanes. If you tax airplanes, they'll buy luxury mansions. There's always something you can switch to. No, I think if we want to take the tax approach to rein across the board consumption increases in where they do the least good, the simplest proposal is one I've long advocated, which is the progressive consumption tax. You report your income to the IRS the same as you always do, maybe simplify it, that would be a good thing. Then report how much you added to your savings during the year. That's what people do for their tax-sheltered retirement accounts. The difference between those two numbers, income minus savings, is how much you spent during the year. That minus a standard deduction is what we tax. And there's no tax for small amounts, small rates of tax for intermediate amounts, but then let that number grow big enough and we can keep raising the marginal tax rate on it as much as we like. We will not only won't discourage investment and savings by doing that, we'll encourage it.
Well, I think it's obvious what the obstacles are to the implementation of such a policy, right? You'd have to convince a majority of influential voters to vote in favor. But there are other more controlled environments where you don't have to go out and convince that many people. So within organizations, and I think in choosing the right pond, you talked about how organizations are these enclosed environments, and they can kind of decide on what the various rankings are and the status hierarchies are within that organization. How can an organization make sure that the efforts and labor of the people in the organization are directed towards productive economic activity and not towards kind of positional battles? Or are those tournaments inside the organization a necessary price that has to be paid for the harnessing of people's energy towards the building?
You don't want to say incentives don't matter. I mean, I think there are reasons that salespeople are put on commission rather than straight salary. They'll hustle more. But there are limits to incentives. We know that factory workers always and everywhere organize to try to inhibit the use of piece rates in their pay schemes. Why? Because they say if management sees how productive we can be under the piece rate, they'll just reduce the piece rate, and then we'll have to work twice as hard for the same money we used to get. That may be a valid fear in some instances, but it's also true that creative management could figure out ways to get around that problem. So I think you have to really look at the incentive problem on a case-by-case basis to see what to do there. But there's no incompatibility between preserving incentives in microenvironments and at the same time taking macro steps that lessen the impact of a lot of these arms races. I mean, just having a single payer healthcare system would take enormous pressure off people. People would be free to quit their jobs and try an entrepreneurial venture in a way that they're not now.
But one of the things you mentioned in the book is that the ratio of CEO salary to entry-level employee has just exploded over the last couple of decades. And I think part of the explanation is that the labor mobility, right? The external labor markets. So, if you were to somehow compress the wage ladder within the organization, some of those folks would just leave to go to other organizations that offer the the
Yeah,
higher
that's
compensation
why. I mean,
packages,
there's the
right?
old statement: you can't have socialism in one country. If you want to solve collective action problems, it's often impractical to do that in too micro a level. I had some activists approach me years ago to try to come up with a proposal for a single payer health plan for Ithaca, New York, and as I tried to explain to them, if we did that, then the taxpayers who would have to support it would have an incentive to move to surrounding counties. The people who needed health care in surrounding counties would have an incentive to move to Ithaca. It would collapse. I don't know, maybe economists exaggerate that problem. Massachusetts did a healthcare program of that sort within the state, and it didn't seem to lead to a complete disaster. But the problem is real, and if we can solve it at a broader level, that's often better than solving it at a narrow level. But still, local environments are the ones we care most about. If the Army doesn't pay a very high wage, and yet people who are in career positions in the Army don't seem to feel disgruntled about that. They're earning what they expect to earn, what their colleague, and they've got a very secure system of benefits, so they can't be said to have a lack of things that people are truly said to need. And anyway, proposals to cap executive pay really are malevolent. If we capped CEO pay, then we'd see more personal injury lawyers. The problem is that pay at the top has escalated very, very sharply, well beyond any consumption needs of people at the top. We can argue about how much of that is due to the fact that people at the top are worth more. That was the claim Phil Cook and I staked out in the Winner Take All Society, namely that technology has amplified the productivity differentials of the best players. They can serve a broader swath of the market now than before, and so they're worth more. That doesn't mean that they need to be paid more to be willing to do the work. If we tax them more heavily, most of that is rent. They would be happy to do the same jobs they're doing now. So really, there are simple levers we could pull to get the resources we need to make the public investments that we haven't been making. They wouldn't require any painful sacrifices from the people at the top. The trick is to persuade the people at the top that that's true. I say they suffer from a cognitive illusion because, they're not worried that we're going to tax them so heavily that they're not going to be able to buy what they need. Nobody's got a proposal to do that on the table. What are they worried about? They're fearful that they won't be able to buy the special extras that they really want. But what are those things? Those are the luxuries that are almost in every case in short supply. How do you get them? You have to bid against other people like you who want them. If I pay more in tax and you pay more in tax and we each want the same penthouse apartment and there's only one of them to go around, the same person's going to get it after the tax increase as would have gotten it before the tax increase. People at the top don't realize that taxes would be painless in that way. Why? I mean, normally, if somebody proposed to increase your taxes, you try to think back, how did I feel the last time they did that? Well, there hasn't been a last time they did that. In our environment, tax rates have been falling steadily since World War II. So what do? You try to think back, well, so I can't use that heuristic. I'll try to think back to the last time I had less income because, as everyone agrees, if they tax me more, I'll have less income to spend. And there were times when I did have less income, unless you lead a really charmed life. So you had a divorce or a business downturn or a health crisis or a house fire. If something happened, you had less money than before. Those were always miserable years. And so somebody's going to take money from you. I don't want that. I'll hire lobbyists to oppose it. I had a talk with Ezra Klein on his podcast, and I said, somehow it came up, how much money would it be good? I never regretted not being a multi-billionaire, but if I were one, I would have a good use of the money. I would go to Pixar. I would hire their best animation team. I would hire them to make a 10-minute video explaining why, if the wealthy paid more in tax, we could be able to provide public goods that would be of great value to them and others, and that the sacrifices they fear would be necessary for them in the domain of private consumption would be completely painless, in fact.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people that are skeptical, not about the idea of paying more taxes, but skeptical that the taxes would be put to good use. And you mentioned that, even if there's an enormous amount of waste in the process, there'll be enough good that will come from it. I think a lot of folks in California I know who are skeptical. San Francisco, they see themselves as paying very high taxes, and they're disappointed in the provision of public goods that they see coming out of those taxes.
It's true that governments do build bridges to nowhere. They do spend some money that doesn't yield good outcomes. But there's waste in the private sector too. And if you actually want to talk about dollar magnitudes, go over any government budget. I mean, most of it is for kind of bread and butter stuff. Maybe the pothole crew is, some of them are leaning on their rakes instead of tamping down when they ought to be. But the waste there is fairly small scale. But if you ask, what about the mansion that comes in at 60,000 square feet when it could have been 30,000 square feet? Is that waste? If the only reason it needed to be 60,000 square feet was that others in that circle had ones that big, that's pure economic waste there too. So by any reasonable measure, the waste in the private spending stream is much, much bigger than the public stream. That George Bush liked to say, the people know how to spend their own dollars much more carefully than any bureaucrat would, and I think that's a plausible claim, but it completely misses the point. People spend their money as best they can, given their individual aims. But if your aim is to have a house as good as the next guy, then you buy from the low bid contractor, controlling for quality, but you still end up with a 60,000 square foot house. It's not that you don't know how to spend your money. You know perfectly well how to spend it. It's just that your incentives, you and others, to spend your money are to spend it in ways that are profoundly wasteful. And that there's evidence for that.
You refer to the toil index and how there's like a discontinuity there that's happened in the recent years. And it seems to line up with the rise of double income households. Is there a argument in favor of restraining the amount of labor that can come out of a single household, right? So the French have their 35-hour work weeks. Could we somehow restrict working hours or do something like that to restrain? If everyone had a single income coming out of their household, then presumably real estate prices would be dramatically lower without any great loss of
that was
of life,
exactly
right?
the point made in a 2004 book called The Two-Income Trap. It was by Elizabeth Warren, now the senator from Massachusetts, and her daughter, Amelia Tyagi Warren. And the question they asked was, how come it is that these days, meaning in the early aughts, two-income families are struggling to get by, whereas back in the 50s, families with only one paycheck were making ends meet quite comfortably. And the answer they gave was that the second paycheck went to fuel a largely fruitless bidding war for houses in better school districts. So yes, I think the ability to tax resources that are associated with harmful activities, and that harm in a very general sense, to provide coverage for the things that really matter the most. And having more time to spend with family and friends, that's one of the blue chip contributors to human well-being in all the studies of the determinants of well-being. A physical therapist I worked with for a while after shoulder surgery a few years ago said he'd been in Australia for a few years and people seemed much happier there. And he was trying to figure out why. And he finally decided that it was because the three things people worried most about here: how do I pay the bills if I get sick? What happens when I retire? How do I send my kids to college? All that was taken care of in Australia. People didn't have to worry about that. We could do that. we could have a healthcare system that meant you wouldn't face any risk of a catastrophic financial meltdown if you got sick. We could make sure that you had comfortable living conditions in retirement. We could make sure everybody had access to a 4-year degree without breaking the bank. Those are all things we could do. But instead, we spend our money on ever heavier and higher horsepower cars, bigger mansions, more jet trips and cruise trips to distant locations. Those expenditures that haven't been shown to reliably boost human well-being.
Right. I think that we used to think that experiences were more likely to lead to happiness than possessions, but now I think experiences are part of the arms race, right?
Depends what kind of experience.
You gotta exactly. I wanted to ask you about kind of the ESG movement. It seems to be taking off in a big way. I spend a lot of time with pension fund investors, and certainly students are very active in trying to promote responsible behavior on the part of corporations, and in their own personal lives, they take their consumption and investment very seriously, the ethical implications. And so in some sense, this is kind of an example of a success story where, you have a norm cascade that, like you describe in the book. But there's also some concern that this is working as a substitute for actual policies that might make an impact, right? It's hard to imagine that people, not using plastic straws in their cocktails is going to somehow, save the oceans. And it's hard to imagine that, individuals who go around turning off their lights are going to, refuse to buy stocks in automobile companies that use internal combustion engines is going to somehow solve the global warming crisis.
I would say that was one of the big issues that working on this most recent book changed my thinking about. I was in lockstep with most of my economist colleagues in thinking that examples like the ones you cited of what I think are often called conscious consumption, voluntary restraint on behalf of the environment, were really an ineffective way to try to address the problems that people are worried about. If I buy a hybrid, the air quality is the same as if I don't buy a hybrid. If everybody else bought one, that would matter. But then if everybody else bought one, the air quality would be good, even if I didn't buy one. So economists have always, arguing in terms like that, favored robust changes in public policies like high levels of public investment in green energy, a very stiff carbon tax, things of that sort that give people very little choice but to behave in a way that has beneficial effects on the environment. I still think those policy changes are necessary, but I've completely backed away from the claim that those individual steps aren't useful. And it's really two things that led me to change my mind about that. One is that the individual steps, it's true that the direct effect of them is small, trivial, insignificant, however you would want to characterize it, but that's not the end of the story typically. So that if, for example, in Southern California, if I put a solar panel on my roof, according to one seminal early study, 4 months would pass before somebody copied me. And they have ways of estimating whether that second installation would have occurred even if I hadn't done that. So this is an actual copycat installation. Mm-hmm. Another 4 months pass. Each of those two installations spawns another copycat. So we've got 4. So another 4 months pass, we've got 8. After 2 years, we've got 32 solar panels. That's just in the one zip code. The installers of those panels all have friends and relatives who live elsewhere. They talk to them. Those conversations have even more influence than the examples of neighbors. So it's a huge multiplier. You do a small thing. What you do has an effect on what others do. What they do has an effect on what still others do, and so on. So to say that's not important is just to miss the magnitude of the impacts of that sort. But the other reason I changed my mind, I think may even be more important, which is that I think economists have the wrong picture when we assume that people come into the world with fully shaped identities and preferences. Aristotle saw this more clearly. He said, we are works in progress. We become who we are. We're creatures of habit. And so when you engage in even a minor act of self-denial, you walk instead of drive, you eat less meat one day a week, you alter who you are. If you weren't a climate advocate to begin with, you become more of one. If you were one, you become more of one there too. And then you become much more likely to knock on doors, to write checks to the campaign committees of politicians who will, if elected, enact the policies that economists have always said we need to enact. So I think the individual behaviors are vastly more important than I ever imagined.
So they're more of a complement than a substitute. There's a feedback
pump
loop,
priming device in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you describe some of these kind of norm cascades in the book, which we've lived in the last 20 years, like gay marriage and legalized marijuana. I think, the collapse of the Soviet Union was another one. But those other ones more recently, I think if you asked a typical person 20 years ago, what's the likelihood that you'll see in your lifetime, say, universal gay marriage in the United States, I think very few people would have thought that might happen. And yet, with Andrew Sullivan's article and you described the process, and you have you have an economic model, right, which is kind of an information cascade, built on information cascade idea, which is very compelling. Do you see the possibility of a similar type of change in thinking around, say, global warming? Is that possible in our lifetime?
We're in the midst of a huge cascade already there. I mean, it wasn't very long ago that ostensibly serious people in the U.S. were arguing about whether there was climate change underway. I very rarely hear anybody advance that argument anymore. I mean, Inhofe, the senator from Oklahoma, a lofty committee chair, brings a snowball into the Senate chamber on late February day as proof that the climate couldn't be heating up. He might do that again, but my bet is that he won't do that again. He suffered a fair amount of ridicule when he did it then. He would be laughed out of the chamber if he tried that today. I think the question now is, how do we stop people from thinking that the problem is hopeless, that it's too late to act? It is not too late to act by my reading of the evidence. And in fact, the effort we would need to mount in order to contain the problem, although hugely costly in absolute terms, would not be a psychological burden of any great sort, given what we know from history. I mean, we mounted a big effort on similar scale in World War II. People were not unhappy in World War II. There was a great sense of community and solidarity, pulling towards a common goal. People had food. Mm-hmm. If you learned that a relative had been killed in the war, of course you were unhappy. But the idea that the temporary shunting of resources away from consumption towards common purpose was psychologically aversive. No, there's no evidence for that at all.
I mean, I think the resources necessary to reverse it could potentially be less than a substantially lower fraction, a small fraction of what we've expended on the coronavirus mitigation.
And as Ezra Klein once said, the cost of dealing with climate change is high only if you ignore the cost of not dealing with climate change. The dollar magnitudes of the damage that we face in prospect are just inconceivable.
Mm-hmm. Well, towards the end of the book, you have some words to say about persuasion, right? And how difficult it is, but you also offer some hopeful ideas around persuasion. And you tell a story about how you were giving a talk to an audience people who are initially hostile to the idea of a consumption tax, and you were able to kind of persuade them that it made sense. But then you also mentioned that if you had to do this in a tweet, it would probably not work. Do you worry that the quality of discussion around so many policy issues is relatively low in certain environments, or are you optimistic? I mean, I certainly am surrounded by stacks right now as we speak of, incredibly well-written books, and the volume of well-written books just seems to be growing exponentially.
Yeah,
I certainly can't keep up. But when you look around in the broader world, you do see just battles of tweets and people not paying attention. Is that a new thing? Is that is it just an illusion that it's a new thing?
It doesn't have to be book length to get somebody to think in a fresh way about something. I cite in the book one example that was very instructive to me. The title of my last chapter is "Ask, Don't Tell." If you try to explain to your conversation partner why she's wrong, that never works. You just kindle a defensive reaction, and you get nowhere. If you can somehow ask the right question, just engage, listen attentively, and find the right moment to ask the right question, often that can get somebody to think in fresh ways about even a pretty stubborn problem. And I think the best example I ever came across of that sort was in a conversation with an opponent of Obamacare. Like most opponents of it, he liked some features of the Affordable Care Act, the fact that insurers couldn't deny you coverage at affordable rates if you had a pre-existing conditions. That was a good thing. But the mandate, that was just an absolutely unjustifiable violation of the individual liberty we all celebrate in the country, and so on. I asked him, what did he think would happen if the government required insurance companies to sell fire insurance at affordable rates to people after their houses had already burned down? And that's not a threatening question. It's not even all that interesting a question, but it does prompt at least a moment of thought. He thought about it for a moment, didn't take long. Insurance companies would go bankrupt if the government required that. Why? Because who would buy insurance before his house burned down if he could buy it at the same rate after his house burned down? And from there, it's just a short step to see that the guy with a pre-existing condition is the guy whose house has already burned down. In the house market, you get everybody in the insurance pool because nobody knows whether his house is going to burn down. But when people know who's in which group, the only way you can have health insurance that works is for everybody to be in the pool. And the only way you can get the people who are healthy in the pool is by requiring them to be in the pool. And they get that. They say, well, maybe I need to think about the mandate. But you don't find many opportunities to ask a question that has quite that dramatic an effect. But it's worth thinking about. If I were talking to an opponent, what question might I ask that would be non-threatening? I wrote a book about luck. You held it up when we're getting started. Telling rich people to try to remember that they've been lucky on their paths to the top, that they didn't do it all themselves, that the government paid for the education of the workers they'd hired, that it paved the roads, they shipped their goods to. That kindles an enormously hostile reaction. When Obama gave a speech to that effect, people called it the "you didn't build that" speech. Instead, what I found, if you ask a successful person, can you think of any examples of lucky breaks you enjoyed along the way to the top? They don't find that a threatening question. They think about it. Their eyes light up when they can think of an example. They tell you about it. Telling you about it kindles the memory of a second example. They tell you about that too. Soon they're saying, why aren't we investing more in the schools? So yeah, I think conversations with people in opposite camps are very difficult, but it's worth thinking about the possibility of steering them in productive directions. It's not an endeavor that's always and everywhere doomed to failure. We can make progress there too.
And you mentioned in your teaching that you use techniques where students are required to apply concepts in ways that force them to learn on their own rather than sort of being lectured to. What techniques would you advise, whether instructors of economics or other disciplines, to use to try to help students to learn better?
The lucky thing in economics is that there are really only a short number of ideas that do most of the work. We would argue.
You do have a pretty thick
we would
book
argue
here,
for a
so
long
just
time
saying.
about what would appear on a list of the half dozen or so important ideas. But if we asked 1,000 different economists, we'd get 1,000 different lists. There'd be a lot of overlap in the items on those lists, and I think the courses fail, and they do fail on average. I mean, the students who take introductory courses don't score any better on exams that test their comprehension of basic principles given 6 months after they left the course than other people given those same exams who didn't even take the course at all. What a dismal performance that is. And I think mainly it's because we try to teach far too much. You've held up the book. It is thick. The book has to be thick because people have different ideas about what they want to teach. But my exhortation to people teaching the course has been to try to figure out in advance the things you think are most important, and then find ways to come back to those again and again in the context of examples drawn from familiar contexts, and let people see them at work. And the assignment that has really worked best for me over the years is something I call the economic naturalist writing assignment. And it's very simple. I tell students, pose an interesting question based on something you've experienced or seen personally out there in the world, and then use simple economic principles in an effort to craft a plausible answer to it, 500 words max. They have to do 2 of these during the term. It's not easy to come up with an interesting question. Most of the questions aren't nearly as interesting as the ones you saw in that book. But the best ones are really interesting, and I always share the best ones with students. They talk about them with one another. That's a conversational goldmine. If you can ask an interesting question, one that makes your conversation partner say, "Yeah, why is that?" Then that's your key to getting someone to pay attention to you. I mean, a psychiatrist friend told me that the scarce resource going forward will be the willingness of other people to pay attention to us. There are all these attention monsters out there. We can't get anybody to listen to us anymore. So one student asked, why did they require toddlers to be strapped into safety seats in the back of your car when you drove 2 blocks to the grocery store, but they'll let you have your toddler sit loose on your lap when you fly to Tokyo? Mm-hmm. He said he'd ask classmates that question, and they would say, "Oh, well, if the plane crashes, you're going to die anyway, so what does it matter if you're..." And he thought about that. He said, well, first of all, they thought it was an interesting question, but he knew that couldn't be the answer to it, because seat belts had been required in planes long before they were required in cars, because in the early days of aviation, there was a huge danger from injuries from turbulence, and being strapped in a plane meant a much increased probability of injury-free travel, much more so than being strapped in a car. So he concluded on the basis of that observation that if there was a rationale for the asymmetry in regulation, it had to be not on the benefit side of being strapped in, but on the cost side. And when he thought about it in those terms, he said, yeah, if you have a seat set up in the back of your car, it's essentially free to strap your kid in, the few seconds of effort it takes to do it. If you're on a full flight to Tokyo, you got to buy an extra seat. That could be a couple of $1,000s. We don't want to say this to people, but the reason we don't require you to strap your kid in on the flight is that it's too expensive. That's an interesting question. It's worth a few minutes conversation. When students repeat these questions over the dinner table when they go home for breaks, their families seem interested. They report them when they come back to see me. Years later, reunion time, many of them stop by my office and say, "Oh, listen to this one I thought of," and they'll pose an even more interesting question, one that I hadn't seen. So I think if you can get people to experience the pleasure, the intellectual pleasure of answering an interesting question, one that they in themselves found themselves curious about, that ignites a process whereby as each year passes, they get better at applying economic ideas rather than have them just decay in a matter of weeks.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talk in the book about success and luck. And of course, you can't succeed without being a hard worker. And we know you're a pretty darn hard worker, but you've also had quite a bit of luck in your life. And you've had some kind of random fortuitous events that have put you on the path that you ultimately took, such as encountering Dick Thaler at Cornell and going to Washington and working in Washington. What sorts of experiences that maybe were unintended experiences would you recommend that economists try to replicate so that they can get as well-rounded of a background that you've gotten to help generate insights like the ones that you've generated? I mean, when you read your book, it transcends psychology, biology, law, policy, microeconomics, a lot of different disciplines.
The economic naturalist writing assignment I just described is one I use in my introductory course, but I also use it in my intermediate course. I use it in a graduate course on economic policy. I use it in a graduate applied micro course. I've used it at every level and on almost every economics related subject. And my advice to junior colleagues is start working on your next paper topic as if you were responding to that assignment. Keep your eyes open when you go about your business in the world and prepared to be puzzled by something. I mean, you have to have expectations about what you're going to run into in order to be puzzled. I think, most people who study microeconomics are probably overconfident about what they can predict about what people will do. So carry your prediction.
But the more microeconomics you know, the more reality
that's right.
puzzles you, though.
So you're well equipped to be puzzled if you come out of school equipped with the basic microeconomics model, the optimizing model, and notice things that don't fit, and then ponder what's going on there. And if you can come up with an answer that persuades you, you've explained what you saw, that's enormously reinforcing whether the AER will publish it, whether Econometrica is interested or not. But if you're interested in the question, you're much more inclined to expend energy trying to get the answer to it, and you'll spend longer time polishing up the resulting narrative because you're eager to share it with others. And I'd also recommend, if you have an opportunity to do it, to write for a non-professional audience at least some of the time. I've been lucky enough to have been able to write a widely distributed column. It has a word limit. Writing with a word limit is enormously valuable. If you have 1,000 words, your first draft will come in at 1,500, and then you really have to learn a lot to figure out what are the 1,000 words here that really need to be there, or how could this idea be expressed in a way that will tax the reader less, and if you can hone that skill, you'll expand your readership reliably. I think nobody likes to read through cluttered plodding prose. You want to get the lead out.
Great advice. These are really great books to read. They're difficult to put down. I find staying up late at night reading them because they're just super well crafted. And even when you revisit themes from before, you add new stuff. So I really enjoy it. So Under the Influence, Robert Frank, check it out. Start with this and work your way backwards. You've got a good 30 years of fantastic books. And if you want a textbook and you want to skip the class and you don't want to pay $6,000 to take a class a prestigious institution. You can just, read the book and you'll be fine.
Gregory, what a
Thanks
pleasure
so
to
much,
chat with you.
Bob.
This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.